Quicklime and Earl Grey. The Blackwood copse lived up to its name on that Monday morning. The trunks of the old oaks looked like petrified giants in the dense fog, and last year's fallen leaves muffled every step. Mark enjoyed running on the soft forest floor. As usual, Sally darted ahead, but suddenly her behaviour changed. She made a sharp turn to the left, straight toward a hollow overgrown with ferns. "Sally! Out of the undergrowth!" Mark called. He knew that, look, she had scented something. As Mark reached the hollow, he saw Sally already sniffing at a spot that looked strangely out of place. Someone had clearly made an effort to camouflage the ground. Large pieces of forest moss had been spread over the earth like an uneven carpet, but the camouflage had failed completely. The moss was no longer green. Within a very short time it had turned brown and straw-like, as though it had been grilled from below. Sally lowered her head and was just about to start digging with her paw when Mark grabbed her by the harness. "No, leave it!" he ordered sharply. He pulled her back a little and tied her leash short to a young ash tree. Only now, in the sudden silence, did he notice it. A fine whitish haze was rising from the ground. It was not fog. It looked more like steam. And then the smell hit him. A biting, sharp sting in the nose that smelled nothing like the forest. It reminded him of the smell of freshly slaked lime on a building site, mixed with something else that his instinct immediately classified as dangerous. He took a cautious step closer. Beneath the thin layer of soil and half-rotted leaves, something unnatural glimmered through. It was a whitish-grey crust covering the ground at that spot like an ugly scab. Mark picked up a broken branch and carefully prodded the loose earth. The resistance was hard and brittle, like plaster. When he pulled the branch back, a lump clung to the tip. In the damp morning air, the white stuff on the wood began to hiss and foam ever so slightly. He looked at his phone. Reception here in Blackwood Copse was poor, but good enough for an emergency call. Yet, while he dialed the police number, he thought of what people in the village had been saying. He thought of Clarissa Hamilton and how she had solved the priest's case, while Inspector Hazelnut had still been chasing London gangs. Mark broke off the call. The police would come and trample everything with their heavy boots. First, he needed someone who would understand what this was. A shiver ran down his spine. He did not want to touch the stuff, but he knew he had to show Clarissa Hamilton something if he wanted her to believe him. He took one of Sally's waste bags from his running pack. Using the branch as an improvised spoon, he carefully lifted another flaky piece of the white, crusted earth from the ground and let it slide into the bag. At once the plastic fogged up on the inside. The chemical heat could be felt clearly through the material at his fingertips. He tied the bag in a hasty knot and shoved it into the outer mesh pocket of his rucksack, far away from his body. "Come on, Sally," he whispered, unfastened the dog, and ran toward Rosewood. Clarissa Hamilton was sitting on her terrace. In front of her stood a cup of Earl Grey. Steam curled in the cool air. On her laptop screen, the cursor blinked at the end of a sentence about the toxicity of alkaloids. The violent clatter of the garden gate tore her from her thoughts. Mark was standing there, out of breath, his face flushed. Sally stood obediently beside him. "Mrs. Hamilton," Mark gasped, "you have to see this. Sally found something in the Blackwood Copse. The earth, it's almost alive. It's hot." He placed the bag on the stone garden table. Clarissa took it and opened it carefully. She studied the white crust on the dark earth inside with curiosity. "Soil doesn't heat up on its own, Mark," she said, "unless someone has helped nature along with a little chemistry." She ran into the house and came back with a pair of small tweezers. With them, she scraped off a little of the white substance. Could be calcium oxide, she murmured, more to herself than to him. Quicklime, a very efficient means of accelerating organic processes, or of erasing traces. She looked up. At that moment her pale eyes were as sharp as a scalpel. Tell me, Mark, did Sally only find the earth, or was there anything else, a shoe, a piece of cloth? Mark shook his head. I bolted as soon as I felt the heat. Clarissa stood up. She closed the laptop. A wise instinct. But we'll have to go back. Quicklime reacts violently with water, and since it rained last night, someone out there has unintentionally lit a signal fire for us. You know, Mark, she said, holding the bag with the sample up critically to the morning light once more, quicklime is an interesting choice. Who would use such a tool? Mark frowned. An amateur? An educated amateur, Clarissa corrected him. A builder or a gardener would have known that the lime would glow like a torch in this rain, and he would have dug deeper. Whoever did this out there possesses considerable theoretical knowledge of chemical decomposition, but physical labour was clearly foreign to him. He was in a hurry, and he was afraid of dirt under his fingernails. She opened the garden gate. Sally, sensing that they were heading back into the woods, wagged excitedly. We'll take a careful look around before we call the police, she went on, quickening her pace. Once the inspector comes trampling through that hollow in his heavy service shoes, he'll destroy more evidence than the rain. When they reached the hollow, the whitish steam was still visible as a fine veil among the ferns. Clarissa stopped at the edge of the depression. She did not step into the disturbed area at once, but instead probed the ground with the tip of her walking stick, as though testing the density of the soil. "Do you see that, Mark?" she asked, pointing to the brown, straw-like pieces of moss. "Someone tried to patch nature the way one mends an old garment, but moss dies within 3 days if it's grilled from below." She bent forward as far as her back would allow. The white crust was much thicker here, right at the source. Shallow. Far too shallow, she murmured, barely 2 feet below the surface. He relied on chemistry because he ran out of breath. This was no professional, Mark. Suddenly she stopped. Her stick froze at a spot where a thick branch from an old oak ran across the ground. "Please call the police now, but don't tell Hazelnut about the lime. Just tell him Sally found something that looks like human remains. Let's allow him the pleasure of his own discovery." Mark nodded and was already dialing the station. He looked pale, but he remained dutifully at the edge of the hollow. As the finder of the remains, he knew he would have to wait for the inspector to arrive and keep Sally on a short leash. "I'm leaving now, Mark," Clarissa said calmly. She adjusted her rucksack and cast one last, appraising glance at the hollow. "There is no reason why Inspector Hazelnut should know that I happened to take a walk in the woods this morning. It would only lead to unnecessary questions that would waste both our time. Just tell him Sally alerted while you were jogging. That is the truth, and it is quite sufficient." She gave him a brief, encouraging wink and set off back at a brisk pace, before the first sirens in the distance could cut through the morning birdsong. At 55, Clarissa was in excellent health and fitter than most of her neighbours, but she valued anonymity. While Hazelnut was about to play the great investigator, she preferred to unravel the threads in the background. A little later, she was already sitting on her terrace again. In front of her stood a cup of Earl Grey, its delicate steam curling in the cool air. In her mind, she arranged the facts. Calcium oxide, shallow grave depth, a perpetrator who had wanted to accelerate biological processes but had no practice in digging. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Perpetrator profile, academic background, lack of physical routine, access to chemicals." An energetic clatter at the garden gate tore her from her notes. The visitor was Elvira Miller, her greatest admirer in rosewood. She held a book pressed against her chest as tightly as though it were a precious treasure. Clarissa sighed briefly, but then a thought flashed in her eyes. Elvira was not only her biggest fan, but also the social epicenter of the neighborhood, and therefore the perfect source of information. She opened the gate, and Elvira burst out at once. "Oh, Mrs. Hamilton, please forgive the interruption, but I've just bought your latest book, Murder in the Mist, and I thought if I don't ask now, I never will. Would you sign it for me, please?" Clarissa opened the gate wide and put on her most welcoming smile. "But of course, Elvira, come in. I was just about to put the kettle on." "Oh, Mrs. Hamilton, you have no idea," Elvira cried as she crossed the threshold almost reverently. "Murder in the Mist. I devoured it in a single night, the way the detective unmasked that poisoner. Such precision. One can tell at once that you know what you're writing about. The people in the village say you're a little distant, but I always say, genius needs room to breathe." Clarissa led her onto the terrace and gestured toward the empty chair opposite her notebook, which she had discreetly closed a moment earlier. "You flatter me, Elvira. But tell me, what's new in Rosewood? I've been so absorbed in my work lately that I've scarcely noticed anything of village life." Elvira sat down with a contented sigh, the book on her knees like a trophy. "Village life? Oh, Mrs. Hamilton, it's all ups and downs," Elvira began, lovingly stroking the cover of the book. "You know, it's almost as exciting as your novels, only without the bodies. Thank heavens. Take Mrs. Gable from the post office. She was terribly upset that the delivery van for Dr. Brennan's new practice equipment blocked the entire pavement yesterday. Enormous crates, just imagine. But the doctor is so committed. He's modernizing everything." Clarissa poured the tea and handed Elvira a cup. "Modernization is a good thing. Every now and then it simply has to be done." "Of course," Elvira agreed, taking a careful sip. "But much worse is the matter of the most beautiful front garden competition. Have you heard? Old Mr. Henderson actually claimed someone secretly watered his petunias with salt water during the night, just so he would lose to Mrs. Higgins. He was at the police station this morning before the first constable had even had his coffee." Clarissa smiled thinly. "Petunia sabotage? That sounds like a case for Scotland Yard." "Doesn't it just?" Elvira giggled. "And then there's the business with the new vicar. He actually wants to rejuvenate the church choir. Poor Mrs. Dunwoody has been first soprano for 40 years, and now she is suddenly supposed to make room for the butcher's young granddaughter. A scandal. The whole village is divided. There was a regular uproar on the churchyard after the service yesterday." Elvira leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Otherwise, things have gone rather quiet in our part of the world. I think people are all a bit tired because of the weather. Even my Sandra is doing nothing but hiding indoors, and she had so many plans for the garden and had already bought heaps of young plants. But do you know the best thing? The baker now has these new lavender scones. Mrs. Gable says they taste like soap, and that upset him terribly. Now 2 camps have formed, those who like them and the others, the soap party, so to speak. I think they're quite nice, but I don't want to get involved." Clarissa nodded mechanically as she signed the book. "Lavender scones. A bold experiment," she murmured, handing the book back to Elvira. "It is reassuring to know that the village's greatest worries concern baked goods and petunias." "Oh, absolutely," Elvira cried, rising happily. "Thank you so much for the signature, Mrs. Hamilton. Everyone in the reading circle will envy me. I'll leave you to your work now. We'll see you at the charity bazaar on Wednesday, surely." Clarissa accompanied her to the gate. As soon as Elvira was out of sight, the polite smile faded from her face. She looked toward the woods where an hour earlier she had been standing in the damp leaves. The lavender scones were forgotten. Her mind returned to the white crust and the unnatural heat beneath the moss. Clarissa closed the gate and returned to her desk, not to the laptop, but to the old oak desk in her study, which had acquired a slight patina from years of intense thought. She pulled a fresh sheet from the drawer. Who in Rosewood has access to calcium oxide? She began to write, slowly at first, then more quickly as her thoughts gathered pace. First, building firms and tradesmen. Quicklime was a classic building material used in the plastering of old masonry and in sealing foundations. The only active construction site in the village was the renovation of the old barn at the edge of the village, a council contract, carried out by Robson and Sons from Hereford. Clarissa noted the name and put a star beside it. Second, gardeners and farmers. Lime was a common means of correcting soil acidity. In theory, any amateur gardener might have a sack of it in the shed, but the quantity needed to decompose organic matter at that burial depth was considerable. That suggested a professional source, not a private household. Holloway Nursery, she wrote. Frankie Holloway supplies half the village. Third, schools and scientific institutions. Calcium oxide appeared in chemistry laboratories. Rosewood Primary School could be ruled out, but the grammar school in Kettlebury, barely 12 minutes away, had a well-equipped science department. Dr. Holt, she noted, physics teacher, lives in Rosewood. She hesitated longer over the fourth. She tapped the pen against the paper. Dr. Brennan, new practice equipment, crates blocking the pavement. Elvira's chatter echoed in her mind. A doctor had no need of quicklime for his practice, and yet the delivery a few days ago raised a faint question. Medical calcium in its pure form was something else, but who would look closely at what was inside those large crates? She laid down the pen and regarded the list. 4 names, 4 access points. She did not cross out Dr. Holt, but she circled Dr. Brennan. Then she picked up the phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. "Hello, Frankie. Clarissa Hamilton here. I need some lime for the garden." The Black Swan was half full around midday. The fire in the grate crackled and threw a warm light over the dark wood panelling. Clarissa pushed open the heavy door and let her gaze wander, until she spotted Mark in a corner seat. He was bent over a half-empty glass of beer, his elbows on the table. Sally lay curled up at his feet. Clarissa sat down opposite him without asking. The landlord, a quiet man named Bates, brought her an Earl Grey without her having to order. "So, hazelnut was quick." Mark nodded slowly. 2 hours, then they brought the body out. "Identified?" "Not yet." Mark drew his finger through the damp ring his glass had left on the table. "He asked the village to report anyone missing, as if we wouldn't do that of our own accord." Clarissa wrapped both hands around her teacup. "What else did he say?" "He didn't say most of it to me, but whispered it to his sergeant as if I hadn't got ears." Mark leaned back. "But I heard it all the same. There have apparently been similar cases some time before. Same methods, same materials. He's talking about a serial killer." The words hung in the room. A log cracked in the grate. "How many cases?" "He didn't say, only similar cases." He sounded very important. Clarissa set down her cup. Hazelnut and his dramaturgy. He cultivated information like a currency and spent it only when it would make an impression. "Anything else? Traces, witnesses?" Mark shook his head. "Nothing. At least, nothing he said aloud. The woods are sealed off and a crime scene technician from Oxford is on the way." He looked at her. "And that was that." Sally briefly raised her head and then laid it back on Mark's shoe. Clarissa silently took her notebook from her coat pocket. She laid it on the table, her hand flat upon it. A serial killer. That was Hazelnut's word. For the moment, Clarissa preferred a more precise one. Repetition. Someone had used this method before, but that did not necessarily mean it was the same person. It could just as easily have been an imitator, someone trying to divert suspicion from himself. Someone who knew Hazelnut and knew he would fasten on the idea and go hunting a serial killer. Tuesday brought a clear sky and ground still soft after the rain. Before breakfast, Clarissa dug up 2 strong raspberry canes from the garden, wrapped their roots in damp newspaper, and placed them in a jute bag. Elvira Miller lived 3 streets away in a terraced house whose front garden looked very well kept. She opened the door before Clarissa could knock. "Mrs. Hamilton, what a surprise!" "I wanted to bring you something for the garden." Clarissa held up the jute bag, "and get rid of some raspberry offshoots that I'd otherwise have to compost." Elvira clasped her hands like a child at Christmas and led her through the narrow hall into the garden. While Elvira searched for a suitable place for the canes, commenting on every square inch of her flower beds, Clarissa let her gaze roam. The garden was immaculate. Every plant stood exactly where it ought to. "You're bound to do well in the competition," said Clarissa. Elvira waved it away, but her smile betrayed her. "Oh, nonsense! Old Henderson is terribly ambitious this year, although—" She knelt beside a bed. "His greatest rival hasn't shown herself for days." Clarissa paused. "Mrs. Higgins?" Elvira rummaged in the soil with a small trowel. "I called on her yesterday because I wanted to talk about the garden competition, but she didn't answer the door. She was probably still asleep. I was rather early." "When did you last see her?" "Saturday, I think, or was it Friday?" Elvira straightened up and brushed the earth from her gloves. "She's probably sulking because of the Petunia affair. She takes all that very personally." Clarissa nodded, but she was thinking of the hollow in the Blackwood copse, of lime hissing in the rain, of a grave, of withered moss. "Of course," said Clarissa, "sulking seems the most likely explanation." Elvira's daughter Sandra was kneeling beside the last bed at the fence, pressing earth around some newly planted kohlrabi. The movement looked mechanical. She repeated it, even though the soil had long since been firm enough. Clarissa watched her for a while. Her shoulders were drawn up, her movements somehow cramped. She stared at the flower bed. "Sandra, this is Mrs. Hamilton," said Elvira, "the crime writer." Sandra stood up. She was pale and her grey eyes looked glassy, as if she were staring through Clarissa at something only she could see. "Sorry," Sandra said. Her voice sounded flat. "I was just going inside. Do stay a moment longer." Clarissa stepped closer. "The weather is wonderful today, don't you think? A splendid day for working in the garden." Elvira disappeared into the house to make tea, as was her way. Clarissa smiled at the younger woman. Sandra quickly pulled down the sleeves of her cardigan. Her hands trembled as she did so. But Clarissa had already noticed the bruises. "I fell," Sandra said. "You poor thing, did you hurt yourself?" "It's nothing, just a few bruises." Silence spread through the garden. Somewhere above the roofs, a buzzard circled. "Are you unwell?" Clarissa asked, sympathetically. "Don't you feel all right? Would you like to sit down?" Clarissa knew that Sandra had gone through a divorce only a few months earlier. After that, she had suffered from depression and burnout, quit her job, and moved back to the country to stay with her mother and recover. But she did not look recovered at all. Quite the opposite. Sandra swayed. Clarissa steadied her and led her to a garden chair. "Sandra," she began, "what is the matter with you? Shall I call a doctor?" "That isn't necessary. I'm well supplied with medication. It's just a phase." But you don't look as though the medication is helping you. It was, actually. I was already feeling much better, but for the last 3 days. I don't know what I've done during the last 3 days. Her voice grew weaker and weaker, almost childlike. Dr. Brennan gave me those tablets for the burnout, and they did work, at first at least. I felt much better, until a few days ago. Sandra, would you show me these medicines? The young woman reached into her bag and pulled out a packet of tablets. Clarissa took it from her. She found neither a label nor a batch number, only tablets in a paper bag on which had been written by hand, 1 tablet 3 times daily. How long have you been taking them? 2 months. Dr. Brennan says you have to build up a level. They only work if you take them over a longer period. Clarissa unobtrusively slipped 1 tablet into her pocket. That same evening she telephoned Peter Voss, a pharmacist and old acquaintance from London who had often helped her with research. "Clarissa Hamilton," he said, with a warmth that was almost uncomfortable to her. "How lovely to hear from you. May I assist you with a murder case once again?" "That would be nice. I do, in fact, have a suspicion and urgently need a chemical analysis. May I send you a sample by express? I need the composition as soon as possible." The Black Swan was fuller than usual that evening. Word of the discovery in the Blackwood copse had spread, and the rumour mill was grinding. Clarissa sat at her usual table in the alcove, stirring her tea without drinking it. "Connections to London," Hazelnut said loudly enough for even the back table to hear. He stood at the bar with a pint in his hand, and his sergeant nodded along like a well-trained terrier. "Same method, same chemicals. We are currently examining 3 unsolved cases in Southwark." Murmuring. Anxious faces. Someone ordered another beer. Clarissa listened without looking at him. Same chemicals. Hazelnut had said it twice now, and twice what he meant was, "I'm on the right track." Clarissa set down her teacup. A doctor was renovating his practice. Lime against damp in old cellar walls. That was so ordinary no one looked twice. Robson and Sons would have delivered the material. The invoice would be in order, the intended use plausible. Except that apparently not all the large crates had ended up in the cellar, and Sandra Stone had amnesia. Was there a connection? Clarissa thought of the bruises. Were they from a fall or from assault? What if Sandra had not fallen at all? At the bar, Hazelnut raised his pint. "I'll get this man," he said solemnly. 2 days later, Peter Voss wrote by email. Clarissa read the message twice, then leaned back in her chair. High concentration of an unlicensed MAO inhibitor related to a substance in clinical testing since 2023. Known side effect in overdose, paradoxical aggression, memory lapses, motor discontrol, not an approved product, no legal distribution channel. Clarissa closed the laptop. Dr. Brennan was administering illegal medication in his practice, and Sandra Stone was missing several days of memory. Clarissa was sitting in her sitting room while the evening sun cast golden stripes across the carpet. She had asked Dr. Brennan to make a house call, supposedly because she had no strength to leave her bed. He arrived punctually, with a doctor's bag and a smile made of paper-thin politeness. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, Dr. Brennan." Clarissa made an easy gesture toward the sofa. "I'm afraid the strain of the last few days has taken its toll. Sandra spoke in the highest terms of your treatment." He sat down and opened his bag. His movements were smooth, but his eyes studied her with sharpened attention. "Sandra Stone? Had she mentioned me to you?" Clarissa nodded, her eyes resting on the flowering camellia bush outside the window. Yes, she mentioned that the tablets you gave her for her burnout symptoms worked wonders. I thought I might also make use of some of that miracle energy. Brennan paused. The medication, he began, his voice gentle, like a doctor breaking bad news with care. Not everyone responds to it in the same way. I would have to examine your condition more closely. Clarissa inclined her head, as though deeply distressed. You are very welcome to do so. Sandra certainly seems remarkably calm and full of energy. That is exactly the kind of help I need. His smile stiffened. His gaze grew increasingly suspicious. Stronger measures may be required, Miss Hamilton. I could offer a sedative to ease the acute strain. He drew up a syringe. A bark, sharp as a cry in the silence, cut him off. Sally shot in through the open terrace door, and Mark followed, slightly out of breath. Sorry, Clarissa. Mark strolled in, easy and casual. Sally was desperate to get into the garden, and you know what she's like once she gets loose? Clarissa smiled in relief. No problem, Mark. Her gaze shifted back to Dr. Brennan, gentle and innocent. What were you going to inject me with? Brennan carefully returned the syringe to his bag and stood up. I think you should come to the practice for an examination. He left the cottage a shade too hastily. Clarissa sat for a long time at the oak desk after Dr. Brennan had gone. The sun had sunk behind the hills, and the room lay in half-darkness. She did not move to switch on the lamp. Mrs. Higgins, 65 years old, widow, well-kept front garden. At the time, she had barely registered Elvira's casual remark, "She's probably sulking because of the Petunia affair." And she herself had nodded and thought on. But now the fragments arranged themselves with a precision that stole her breath. Mrs. Higgins lived on Birchwood Lane. Sandra Stone was temporarily living with her mother, 3 streets away, near enough for a spontaneous call between neighbours. Clarissa stood up and took the map of Rosewood from the desk drawer. She spread it out on the table and traced the streets with her finger. Birchwood Lane. Yes. She laid her finger on the point and left it there. The next morning her telephone rang shortly after 8. Hazelnut, she said before he could introduce himself. She had recognized the number. A short pause. Mrs. Hamilton? His voice sounded like a freshly ironed shirt, smooth but stiff. I'm calling to inform you that the body from the Blackwood copse has been identified. A certain Mrs. Higgins of Birchwood Lane. Clarissa closed her eyes for a moment. I'm sorry to hear that. I thought you ought to know, Hazelnut continued, with the suggestion in his tone that he was doing her a particular favour. As you are a writer, and have such a feel for local circumstances. He wants something. How may I help you, Inspector? Did you know Mrs. Higgins? Casually, in the way one knows people in a village. And have you noticed anything unusual lately? In her surroundings, I mean, or among her neighbours? Clarissa looked at the map on the table. Nothing specific, she said, but I'll keep my eyes open. Good. He cleared his throat. I am, incidentally, investigating in the direction of a non-local perpetrator. The connections to Southwark— Yes, Clarissa interrupted gently. I heard that at the Black Swan. An interesting theory. Another pause. Then, good day, Mrs. Hamilton. She put down the telephone and stared at the map. A non-local perpetrator. Hazelnut would be searching in Southwark while the killer was unpacking his doctor's bag 3 streets away. She needed certainty about the vehicle. Brennan drove a dark Volvo XC60. She knew this because he had parked it outside the cottage during his house call, and because, an old habit, she read number plates the way other people watched weather vanes. She telephoned Mark. Mark, Did you hear or see anything in the night from Saturday to Sunday? Any vehicle that was out unusually early or late? Mark was silent for a moment. I sleep with the window open, he said slowly. Sally woke me at about 2:30. I thought she needed to go out, but when I got up, she was just lying there listening. Then it went quiet again. Did you see anything? I looked out of the window for a moment. A dark car was driving slowly down the main road, without lights. I thought someone was coming home late and didn't want to wake the neighbours. Without lights, Clarissa repeated. Yes, but I didn't think anything of it. Thank you, Mark. She hung up and wrote down Saturday night/Sunday morning. Approximately 2:30 a.m., dark vehicle, no headlights. Direction, main road, edge of woods. 2 days passed. Clarissa let Brennan believe that her request for a house call had been a misunderstanding. She wrote him a short note, by hand on her best paper, in which she apologized for the inconvenience and told him she was already feeling much better. She put nothing into it that he could recognize as intention, only the quiet assurance, I am not a threat. He would believe what he wanted to believe. That was his mistake, not hers. In the meantime, she drove to Kettlebury. The chemist's there was larger than the one in Rosewood, more anonymous, and was run by a young man with glasses who did not know Clarissa. She asked for a consultation about MAO inhibitors and had him explain in detail which interactions were known with unlicensed substances of that class. Paradoxical aggression, said the pharmacist, tapping on his keyboard as he spoke. That's the insidious part of these compounds. In the first phase, they have a stabilizing effect. Patients feel better, clearer, calmer. But in certain people and at certain dosages, it tips over. The brain reacts in exactly the opposite way. And do the patients know about it? As a rule, no, it comes on very suddenly, and afterwards, he shrugged, memory gaps, sometimes complete amnesia for the incident. Clarissa nodded and thanked him. On her way back to Rosewood, she drove through Birchwood Lane. She did not stop. She simply drove slowly enough to see Mrs. Higgins's front garden. The flowers were still standing. No one had watered them. Sandra answered the door herself when Clarissa knocked on a Thursday morning. Elvira was obviously not at home. She looked better than last time. But that did not reassure Clarissa. It alarmed her. Better could mean Brennan had adjusted the dose, controlled, calculated. May I come in for a moment? Sandra stepped aside without a word. They sat down in the small kitchen. Clarissa did not waste time on preliminaries. Sandra, I need to ask you something, and I ask you to be honest with me, not for my sake, for your own. The young woman clasped her cup tightly. Do you remember last Saturday? Silence. I was with the neighbour, Sandra said at last. Her voice sounded as if it were coming from very far away. I wanted to swap plants. We had arranged it. And then? Sandra's knuckles turned white. I don't know what happened after that. I only know I was crying and that Dr. Brennan was there and that he injected me with something. She swallowed. And then I was here in my bed and my arms hurt. The bruises. Sandra nodded almost imperceptibly. Clarissa waited a moment, then she said quietly, Sandra, Mrs. Higgins is dead. The cup did not fall from Sandra's hands, but her eyes widened, and in them Clarissa saw something she identified as recognition, not surprise, the ordering of something that had been buried deep and was now being forced violently to the surface. I killed her. Sandra's voice broke. You were not yourself, said Clarissa. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but not cold. The substance Dr. Brennan gave you is not licensed. In some people it causes exactly what happened to you. That is documented. That is provable. I pushed her. Sandra's voice was barely audible. She fell. I still remember that she fell, and then she pressed her hand over her mouth. Clarissa let the silence remain in the room. Sometimes silence was the most humane thing one could offer. After a long moment, she continued, Dr. Brennan gave you a powerful injection. He brought you home, and he made sure you would remember as little as possible. She paused briefly. He did not do that out of compassion. Sandra looked at her. He is protecting himself, said Clarissa, because the tablets he gave you would send him to prison, and because he knows that without your memories you will keep silent out of fear, guilt, and shame. What am I supposed to do now? Clarissa placed both hands flat on the table. First, have the tablets tapered off, and find yourself a new doctor. She spoke very clearly. Then, you speak to me. Everything you remember, every scrap, I shall write it down, and then we go to the police together. They won't believe me. Yes, said Clarissa, because I shall bring them something they must believe. A chemical analysis, a witness statement, and a pattern that Inspector Hazelnut has so far entirely overlooked. That evening, Clarissa sat at her oak desk. The list before her was no longer an open document, but a closed circle. Dr. Brennan, unlicensed substances, clinical trial financed by third parties, patients, vulnerable, isolated, dependent, side effects, knowingly accepted. Death of Mrs. Higgins, unintended, but the cover-up was entirely intended. She crossed the other three names off her list. Robson and Sons, Frankie Holloway, Dr. Holt. Then she circled Brennan's name, this time with a different pen, darker ink. Hazelnut is looking for a serial killer in Southwark. He will find nothing, because he is looking in the wrong place. She closed the notebook. Tomorrow morning she would call Inspector Hazelnut, not to explain how he had made his mistake, but to give him exactly what he needed to correct it, in a way that would allow him to save face. That was how she had worked for years. Find the truth, and then make sure the right people placed it in the right hands. She stood up, switched off the desk lamp, and went into the kitchen to put water on to boil. Outside all was quiet. In Rosewood, the village slept, and in a surgery on the main road sat a doctor who believed he had everything under control. The conversation with Hazelnut lasted 14 minutes. He interrupted her 3 times. After the third, he listened. She placed Peter Voss's analysis on his desk, the notebook beside it, and explained in concise sentences what she knew and what he did not. She did not mention that she had taken the sample herself. She did not mention that she had been at the scene before him. She gave him the facts in such a way that he could regard them as his own conclusion. Dr. Brennan was arrested at his surgery. The doctor's bag was still standing on the desk. In the cellar, they found further samples of the unlicensed substance, carefully labelled, not for patients, but for an interim report to a pharmaceutical company based in Dublin, which had been operating under a different name since 2022. For the first 2 weeks afterwards, Sandra Stone scarcely left the house. Her mother looked after her and talked, as she always did, about the garden, the competition, the lavender scones. Sometimes that helped more than any analysis. Clarissa sent her a small basket of raspberry canes, carefully wrapped in damp newspaper, and a note on which she had written, "For next year."